The morning sun stretched its golden rays over the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, casting long shadows that danced across its grand walls. Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the latest security dispatches from the embattled northern provinces when his aide slipped in silently, carrying a sealed diplomatic envelope embossed with the unmistakable insignia of the United Nations. The weight of 23 million Burkinabe citizens seemed heavier than ever as he slid open, eyes scanning the carefully worded lines. An urgent invitation to an emergency African development summit in New York, just days after his blistering speech denouncing neo-colonial meddling in Africa's affairs. The timing reeked of more than coincidence. The letter spoke of regional stability and international cooperation, but Traoré got told him this was a stage set for something else entirely. He set the letter down, walking to the window overlooking the sun-baked capital. Hawkers hawked their wares. School children in pressed uniforms weaved to the market's maze, their laughter bouncing off red clay walls. This, vibrant, stubbornly independent, was the Africa he refused to bargain away. As Burkina Faso's youngest-ever president, he'd learned how to read the truths hidden between polite lines of Western diplomacy. His recent demands for monetary sovereignty and rightful mining revenues had clearly touched a raw nerve. "Ready the delegation," he ordered, voice calm but edged with steel. "And double the security detail. We're not going alone." His head of security appeared moments later, the fatigue of decades in the field showing in the furrows of his brow. "Excellence," he began, voice hushed. "There's chatter about unusual movements surrounding the summit." Traoré nodded once, eyes already narrow at the traps he sensed ahead. When his presidential jet touched down at JFK under a brooding October sky, the air thrummed with unspoken tension. He adjusted his woven Kent sash draped over a tailored Western suit, a deliberate reminder that he carried the continent's soul into these cold marble halls. His security team fanned out with silent choreography, scanning every hangar shadow. The American protocol officers forced polite smiles that cracked at the edges. Even from the aircraft windows, Ibrahim could see the heavy security cordon around the diplomatic terminal, a reception that felt more like a watch list than a welcome. As the motorcade wove through Queens, the city pulsed with anticipation for the summit, but Ibrahim's eyes caught every suspicious detail. Dark SUVs tailing too perfectly, men murmuring into discreet comms. His chief of staff leaned in, whispering about last-minute logistical changes that reeked of engineered isolation. The route changed twice, causing delays that tested even Traoré's legendary patience. Surveillance cameras along the route seemed trained exclusively on his convoy, the metallic eyes of a system that saw him less as a guest than a threat. The UN's gleaming glass tower reflected the mid-afternoon sun, a cathedral of contradictions where noble ideals met realpolitik's sharpened knives. Inside, security lines snaked endlessly. Metal detectors beeped in a humiliating chorus. African delegates were singled out for extra checks, while European entourages breezed through, unchallenged. His aides recorded everything, every deviation from protocol. When they separated his delegation into different lines, the insult was as clear as it was calculated. His security chief met his eyes, and Traoré gave the faintest nod. "We see exactly what this is." Inside the vast lobby, clusters of world leaders gathered like knots of hushed conspirators. Conversations froze when he approached, replaced by thin smiles that never touched wary eyes. Allies who once embraced him now stood at a calculated distance. The seating plan had been updated overnight. Burkina Faso's name tag pushed to the furthest row, far from the VIP circle. Even the cameras seemed trained on the expected players, ignoring him as though erasure were strategy. But Ibrahim Traoré had not come this far to vanish into the margins. High above, on the 38th floor behind a secure conference door, Donald Trump reclined in a leather chair, his fingers drumming out a staccato of irritation on the polished table. Security screens flickered with feeds from the assembly hall below. Spread before him were snapshots of Ibrahim's fiery rallies, calls to shutter foreign military bases, speeches urging a return of stolen African wealth. "This kid's becoming a nuisance," Trump muttered, the word kid carrying the sting of the old colonial script. His chief of staff grimaced, understanding what had to be done. Secret Service Director James Morrison shifted uncomfortably as Trump spat out the order. "I want him out of that room." I don't care how you do it. Make it look legit. Morrison had spent 2 decades protecting heads of state, not manhandling them. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his encrypted phone. The message pinged down the chain. Initiate incident protocol. Remove Traoré under security pretext. Field agents. Earpieces buzzing. Exchange looks. Every one of them knowing this could blow up into a scandal big enough to topple alliances. In the cavernous assembly hall, Traoré settled into a seat. The speech that had rattled so many folded neatly in his briefcase. His bodyguards noticed a shift instantly. Secret Service agents forming a perimeter, hands close to sidearms, eyes like hawks waiting for a signal. His chief guard, a man who'd survived insurgencies and coup attempts, recognized the scent of an imminent snatch and grab. Secretary General Guterres called for order. Cameras panned across delegates, the hush of global attention pressing down like a weight. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The voice rang out. Ibrahim rose, back straight, shoulders square with a resolve that had made him a folk hero from Ouagadougou to Nairobi. As he approached the podium, every step seemed to stretch the tension thinner, tighter, until it might snap. He laid his hand on his speech. 3 Secret Service agents closing like a trap, springing shut. "Sir, step away from the microphone," the lead agent barked, voice sharp enough to slash through the hall's reverent silence. Gasped murmurs rippled through the chamber. African delegations rose from their seats like a tide swelling behind him. Cameras zoomed in, hungry for the spark that would ignite headlines. "Mr. Traoré, you must come with us for security reasons," the agent pressed, hand hovering over his sidearm in a silent threat that rang louder than any gunshot. Ibrahim's security chief stepped forward, but the president lifted a hand, stilling him with a look that said, "Hold your ground." He turned to the cameras, to the millions watching in cities and villages and crowded markets across Africa. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried like thunder. "I stand here not as your suspect, but as the voice of a free Africa." His eyes locked on the agent's trembling hand. The African delegation stood in unison, a wall of defiance that no security protocol could dissolve. For a heartbeat, the world saw it. The unbowed leader refusing to be treated as a threat on the land of his oppressors. The summit room held its breath, caught between the violence of old power and the birth of a new resistance. "I am the democratically elected president of Burkina Faso," Ibrahim Traoré declared, his steady voice slicing through the thick, charged silence of the UN Assembly Hall. "And I will address this assembly as is my sovereign right." His words hung in the air like a banner of defiance, so crisp and clear that even the Secret Service agents hesitated mid-step, their earpieces crackling with frantic instructions from superiors now unsure whether to risk an incident broadcast live to billions. What was supposed to be a quiet, surgical removal had instead become a global trial of African dignity against the brute muscle of American authority. Traoré's calm refusal to yield transformed the agent's hush orders into a blunder that no spin doctor could disguise. The entire world leaned in, watching, waiting, knowing they were witnessing a defining moment for how Africa would engage with global superpowers from that day forward. The young president's eyes, hard yet calm, swept across the sea of dignitaries. He was no longer just a head of state, but the vessel of every silenced African voice. "I stand here not just as Burkina Faso's leader," he said, his voice low but rolling like distant thunder, "but as the living voice of every African who refuses to be silenced by intimidation." His gaze locked onto the lead Secret Service agent, hand still hovering too close to his holstered sidearm. Ibrahim's resolve made the agent's fingers twitch. The unthinkable consequences of manhandling an African head of state now all too real. The tension in the room felt alive, as if even the chandeliers above dared not rattle. For too long, Traoré continued, each word striking the marble walls like a drumbeat. Africa has been told when to speak, where to stand, and how to beg for what is already ours. His hand moved slowly to his briefcase, the faint rustle of paper echoing louder than any gunfire might have. He withdrew his prepared speech, a symbol now of resistance more than rhetoric. "You may remove my body from this podium," he said, voice unwavering, "but you cannot erase the truth from the hearts of my people." The lead agent's eyes darted sideways as his earpiece barked contradictory orders. Nearby, Traoré, as security chief, subtly adjusted his stance. Less a threat than a silent signal that the world was watching this farce play out frame by frame. One by one, African leaders began to rise from their seats. First Ghana's president, then Nigeria's, Kenya's, and South Africa's, turning rows of individual leaders into a singular continent standing shoulder to shoulder. The African section became a wave of solidarity, impossible for even the most biased cameras to crop out. Across the room, lenses shifted, scrambling to capture the full magnitude of what was unfolding. A showdown between a resurgent Africa and the tired reflexes of a power still stuck in an old script. "I traveled 8,000 kilometers," Ibrahim continued, not to be silenced, but to speak for every African child who deserves a continent free from manipulation. Even the agents, trained to follow orders without question, found themselves pausing. Removing him by force now would create an international scandal too big for any press secretary to contain. Traoré's words began to flow, no longer just a speech, but a rebuke echoing across centuries of interference. His calm defiance turned this forced removal into a live masterclass in the quiet force of dignity. Cameras zoomed in on the standing African delegations, a living rebuke to the idea that one leader could be intimidated into silence. The French delegation shifted uneasily, faces pale with the realization that the old games of paternal control were being shredded in real time. The Chinese delegation leaned forward, eyes sharp, calculating new openings to deepen ties with a continent that clearly demanded respect, not charity. At the podium, Traoré's voice rose, never shouting, yet impossible to ignore. "No foreign force will dictate when or where we speak our truth," he said, words amplified by the hush that had fallen over the assembly hall. "Our resources, our people, our sovereignty, these are not bargaining chips. They are not trophies for the highest bidder." The Secretary General clutched the dais, whispers from his legal team confirming what everyone feared. The UN Charter was being tested in full view of a world hungry for authenticity. The Russian and Latin American delegations watched with thinly veiled satisfaction, finding ammunition in a moment that exposed the contradictions of Western diplomacy. Leaders from India and the Caribbean scribbled notes, knowing this confrontation would ripple into their own conversations about foreign policy and self-determination. In the balconies above, journalists spoke urgently into microphones, BBC, Al Jazeera, and African networks alike beaming images of Traoré's stillness as a symbol of collective refusal. Social media feeds across the continent ignited with hashtags, hashtag African dignity, hashtag we stand with Ibrahim, hashtag sovereignty matters. The streets of Ouagadougou, Lagos, and Nairobi buzzed as people gathered around screens, transfixed by a young leader daring to do what many had only dreamed of. The president's words cut through the marble chamber like a chisel against stone. "What you see today is not about one man. This is about a continent that will no longer kneel before empires disguised as allies," he said, the statement painting uncomfortable truths across centuries of diplomatic hypocrisy. He spoke of monetary freedom, of mining contracts that bled African soil dry, of military bases that claimed to protect while sowing division. Traoré's speech transformed the assembly into a living classroom, a blunt lesson in the true cost of neocolonialism, no longer hidden behind polite speeches and empty handshakes. The discomfort of old powers was plain to see. French officials shuffled papers, eyes down. European leaders exchanged tense whispers. A few American diplomats shifted in their seats, their expressions caught between disbelief and a dawning realization. This moment was rewriting the script. Each word was a seed, planted for a generation tired of hearing promises, while living with empty plates and stolen futures. "Africa's youth are watching," Traoré said, voice threading hope to the hall's heavy air. "They see now that dignity is not given, it is claimed." On the floor, even leaders who once felt alone now drew strength from the continent's unified stand. The African Union chairperson rose, her simple gesture transforming her body into a flag of institutional defiance. From the Caribbean to Latin America, murmurs of solidarity crossed oceans in real time. The world was being forced to choose, stand with the right of free nations to speak, or cling to the rotting carcass of colonial privilege. By the time Ibrahim closed his speech, the African delegate's thunderous applause was no longer just about him. It was a salute to a new standard of leadership, rooted in courage, unshakable in principle, and unwilling to trade truth for a seat at someone else's table. He stepped back on the podium, the echoes of his words lingering long after the microphones were cut. Outside, in the streets of Africa's cities and villages, hope moved like a wave, uncontained by borders or fear. In that moment, the world learned Africa would speak for itself, and no agent, no threat, no outdated script would ever silence it again. President Ibrahim Traoré's defining words about Africa's rightful place in the community of nations still echoed to the vast UN Assembly Hall as a thunderous standing ovation erupted. The applause roared like distant thunder, reverberating through the marble chambers long after he stepped away from the podium. The Secret Service agents who had been ordered to drag him out now stood paralyzed, realizing that forcing the issue would ignite a diplomatic explosion too big for any spin doctor to contain. Up at the dais, Secretary General Antonio Guterres moved swiftly, doing his best to restore order. Even with decades of crisis management behind him, he knew this was the most delicate test of his tenure. Down below, the American delegation huddled in tight, frantic circles, their pale faces betraying the shock of a plan that had spectacularly imploded under the scrutiny of the world's cameras. Meanwhile, the African leaders remained on their feet, their unified applause transforming into a protective wall around the young president who had just redrawn the boundaries of continental leadership. Every major news outlet's cameras captured the seismic moment from every angle, ensuring Ibrahim Traoré's unwavering stand would echo in history books and digital archives alike. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of his speech in the tense standoff went viral under hashtags like hashtag Traoré Doctrine, hashtag African Dignity, and hashtag Sovereignty Matters, trending across continents and languages. Commentators rushed to compare Traoré's fearless defiance to the iconic oratory of Nelson Mandela and Thomas Sankara. At the White House, the press secretary's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters demanding to know how a routine diplomatic summit had morphed into the greatest embarrassment of the administration's Africa policy. European capitals scrambled too, fielding uncomfortable questions about their own role in enabling such brazen interference in African sovereignty. Embassies and foreign ministries worked overtime to draft damage control statements, yet the shockwaves only grew stronger. Within hours, the African Union issued a stern emergency statement, calling out the violation of diplomatic immunity and the sovereign dignity of an African head of state. Several African nations immediately recalled ambassadors from Washington for consultations, while others began publicly questioning their military and aid arrangements with the U.S. In Paris, the French government squirmed under the spotlight, as Ibrahim's words had directly denounced decades of lingering neo-colonial influence in Francophone Africa. China and Russia were quick to seize the moment, releasing carefully worded statements supporting Traoré's right to address the world body, subtly rubbing salt into America's self-inflicted wound. The EU found itself divided, with some member states siding with their transatlantic partner, while others, fearing public backlash, demanded the UN review its treatment of African delegations. Back in Africa, news of the standoff spread like wildfire. Across Ouagadougou, Lagos, Nairobi, and beyond, spontaneous rallies formed, young people pouring into streets with placards reading, "We are all Traoré, and African voices will not be silenced." Pan-African organizations wasted no time. They announced an emergency summit to coordinate a unified stance on sovereignty and foreign interference. Meanwhile, Ibrahim's team worked round the clock to manage the tidal wave of interview requests and invitations to speak at global forums. Intelligence agencies in Washington scrambled to contain the fallout as African capitals began questioning every military base, every mining deal, every foreign contract signed under questionable terms. The moment, born of one man's calm refusal to yield, crystallized decades of quiet resentment and turned into a continent-wide demand for a new era of true partnership. The ripple effect was immediate and profound. Within days, Ghana's President Akufo-Addo announced a sweeping audit of all foreign military agreements. Nigeria's National Assembly launched hearings to scrutinize decades-old trade deals. In Kenya, Parliament passed new transparency laws to oversee all foreign aid and investment contracts, lawmakers citing the Traoré Doctrine as their guiding light. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, called for an extraordinary summit to coordinate collective defense of regional interests. International investors and multinational corporations were blindsided. Mining conglomerates operating in Niger suddenly faced new taxes and profit-sharing agreements. American defense contractors learned that lucrative training and weapons deals would be up for renegotiation, with parliaments no longer willing to rubber stamp them. Even Chinese megaprojects, once waved through without question, found themselves subject to rigorous scrutiny. The London Stock Exchange saw immediate turbulence in African mining and energy stocks as shareholders tried to make sense of this new, assertive reality. On university campuses across Africa, Ibrahim's speech became required reading overnight. The University of Ghana launched a new course, African Leadership in the 21st Century, using the UN standoff as a case study. From Cairo to Cape Town, students held debates, lectures, and teach-ins to dissect every word of the speech and its broader meaning for Africa's future. Western think tanks produced frantic white papers warning about the rise of a new, confident African nationalism and its implications for old alliances. Civil society and youth movements found fresh fuel. Environmental activists fighting exploitative mining practices now cited Traoré's words as their rallying cry. Communities living under the shadow of foreign military bases launched new campaigns demanding full sovereignty. Pan-African groups saw surges in donations and volunteers, emboldened by the belief that the continent's time for asking permission was finally over. Years later, Ibrahim's defiance would be remembered as the birth of the Dignity Doctrine, a single moment that redefined how Africa would negotiate its place on the world stage. His stand was written into the African Union's charter as a turning point, where post-colonial dependence gave way to a collective demand for equitable partnerships and respect. The legacy shaped an entire generation of young African politicians who came into office determined never again to trade dignity for foreign approval. The economic consequences of that speech reshaped billions in resource contracts. African nations forced foreign companies to renegotiate mining rights, demanding technology transfer and local job creation. Development aid shifted from handouts to joint ventures with clear frameworks for long-term self-sufficiency. The World Bank and IMF quietly adjusted lending practices, acknowledging they could no longer dictate terms of governments that had tasted true diplomatic self-respect. Culturally, the psychological impact ran deeper than any trade deal. Across Africa's diaspora, the image of Traoré standing unflinching before armed men became an icon, a reminder that African leaders could command a room, any room, without bending the knee. African students memorized his lines the way generations before them had memorized Mandela's or Sankar's. In living rooms, classrooms, and community halls, young people repeated the lesson: African dignity is not negotiable. International media, too, learned that the age of patronizing coverage was dying. Stories about Africa shifted from pity and crisis to admiration for a continent unwilling to be underestimated. The UN implemented new security protocols to prevent any repeat of the scandal, while American foreign policy quietly recalibrated, forced to reckon with the limits of intimidation in an era of viral accountability. And for every African leader who would ever face foreign pressure, Ibrahim Traoré's calm, resolute defiance remained the gold standard. A reminder that real leadership is not the art of compromise at any cost, but the courage to say no when your people's dignity is on the line. The young president who refused to be silenced had done more than just protect his own right to speak. He gave voice to a continent that, from that moment on, would never again accept its place as an afterthought in global affairs. Ibrahim Traoré's standoff at the UN wasn't just a speech. It was a moment Africa stood up and the world finally listened.